In November 1984, inside a Chicago boardroom, International Harvester, the company that taught America how to farm with iron, sold its soul. For $430 million, the agricultural equipment division, the iconic Farmall brand, and the red tractors that built the Midwest were sold to Tenneco. Factories that had poured engine blocks for generations were marked for closure. In rural towns across the country, dealerships lost the name on their signs. Farmers lost the brand their grandfathers had trusted to pull the harvest. Assembly workers watched a century of manufacturing identity vanish overnight. But the paradox of International Harvester is that the machines were not failing. The legendary DT Series diesel engine under the hood was still running flawlessly. The iron was perfect. It was the massive corporate debt and a collapsing 1980s farm economy that broke the empire. The real story of International Harvester is not only the story of a corporate collapse, it is the story of how an engine empire built the American farm, lost its own name, and left behind a piece of iron that refused to die. Every week, we tell the stories of American engines, factories, machines, and industrial names that once taught the country what power sounded like and what happened when the market moved on. Subscribe if that history matters to you. The story begins not with nostalgia, but with a specific place in the American Midwest in 1902. In 1902, the American Midwest was vast, fertile, and fundamentally limited by muscle. Farming was tied to the endurance of draft horses and the crushing weight of steam traction engines, which were too heavy, too expensive, and too dangerous for the average family farm. That year in Chicago, financier J.P. Morgan orchestrated a merger that would change the physical landscape of the country. He combined the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company, the Deering Harvester Company, and three smaller agricultural firms into a single industrial monolith, International Harvester. The new company had massive capital, sprawling foundries, and absolute ambition, but it faced a distinct American absence. The country needed a way to put mechanical power into the hands of ordinary farmers without requiring them to become boiler engineers. The answer arrived not immediately, but through a steady evolution of internal combustion, culminating in 1924 with the introduction of a machine that would redefine the American field, the Farmall. Before the Farmall, early gas tractors were clumsy behemoths that could plow but could not cultivate row crops like corn without crushing them. The Farmall was tall, narrow, and powered by an internal combustion engine, an engine that burns fuel inside its cylinders to create power. This was the breakthrough. It allowed a single machine to replace a team of horses for almost every task on the farm. Early models relied on a rugged overhead valve four-cylinder engine designed to run on kerosene or low-grade gasoline. It was a low-speed, high-torque power plant built with a heavy cast-iron block meant to run all day in a cloud of dust without overheating. This was not about speed, it was about displacement, the total volume swept by the pistons inside the cylinders, and torque, the twisting force that could drag a steel plow through packed earth. To meet the explosive demand, International Harvester opened the Farmall Works in Rock Island, Illinois, in 1926. This factory became a cathedral of American manufacturing, casting engine blocks and assembling tractors that would be shipped by rail to every corner of the country. Farmers who had spent their entire lives managing livestock were suddenly learning the mechanical rhythms of a gasoline engine. They learned how to adjust a carburetor, a device that mixes fuel and air before the mixture enters the engine, right there in the dirt. They learned the precise snap of a magneto-ignition system in the physical effort required to hand crank a cold, four-cylinder block on a November morning. The sound of an IH stationary engine echoing across a Kansas wheat field or a Farmall idling behind a barn in Iowa became part of the auditory backdrop of rural America. These engines were designed with heavy flywheels that maintained momentum, even when the plow hit a massive root. The block, the main engine structure that holds the cylinders and major internal parts, was cast with thick iron walls to absorb vibration and dissipate heat. A farmer could overhaul, a major service process where an engine is taken apart, inspected, and rebuilt to operating standards, the entire engine in the machine shed during the winter months, ensuring it was ready for the spring thaw. But International Harvester understood something that its competitors often missed. An engine is only as strong as the system that keeps it running. A broken crankshaft or a blown head gasket during the autumn harvest did not just mean a delay, it meant financial ruin. So IH did not just build foundries in Chicago and Rock Island. They built a service network, the dealers, mechanics, parts suppliers, and manuals that keep a machine running after purchase. Across rural America, the local IH dealership became the commercial and social center of the farming town. The local mechanic knew the sound of a Farmall engine before it even rolled into the service bay. Parts counters were meticulously stocked with pistons, valves, belts, and bearings. The company published detailed oil-stained service manuals that demystified the machinery. If a tractor broke down in the middle of a field, a farmer knew that a replacement part was only a short drive away and that the dealer stood behind the iron. This dealer network forged a generational trust. Boys who grew up driving a red tractor alongside their fathers grew up to buy red tractors of their own. By the late 1930s, the bright red paint of an International Harvester machine was a staple of the American rural landscape. The company had expanded its reach beyond tractors, producing crawler machines, early pickup trucks, and stationary engines used to run irrigation pumps, feed grinders, and sawmills. In 1939, IH launched the Farmall letter series, including the legendary Model H and Model M. The Farmall M, with its 248 cubic inch four-cylinder engine, became the mechanical standard of American agriculture. It was an unkillable workhorse that cemented IH's dominance. Millions of acres were being turned by IH power. The gasoline and distillate engines were durable, reliable, and deeply understood by the people who operated them. Yet the American farm was changing. The Great Depression and the relentless demands of World War II pushed farms to consolidate and grow larger. A family farm that once cultivated 80 acres was now attempting to manage several hundred. The implements got heavier. The soil required deeper plowing to maximize yield. The old gasoline engines, despite their legendary reliability, had a fundamental limitation. Under heavy, sustained loads, they consumed massive amounts of fuel, and their spark-ignited design lacked the sheer, unrelenting low-end pulling force required for this new era of mass production. The engineers in Chicago looked at the rising costs of fuel, the physical limits of spark-ignited blocks, and the growing scale of the American harvest. They knew that the next generation of American machinery could not rely on the same technology that had replaced the horse. The red iron had conquered the American field. But as the scale of farming grew, gasoline and kerosene were no longer enough to pull the weight of the future. Following World War II, the American farm underwent a rapid and ruthless expansion. Millions of soldiers returned home, the population boomed, and the demand for agricultural output skyrocketed. A family farm that had once survived on 80 acres now needed to cultivate hundreds just to remain solvent. The implements pulled behind the tractors, the plows, planters, and heavy discs, grew wider and heavier. The legendary gasoline engines that had replaced the horse were suddenly hitting their physical limits. Under the crushing, continuous strain of pulling massive steel implements through deep clay, gasoline engines consumed fuel at a staggering rate. Worse, their spark-ignited architecture fundamentally lacked the relentless, low-end torque, the twisting force, felt as the pulling strength of an engine, required to drag heavy weight without stalling. The engineers at International Harvester knew that to power the next generation of American agriculture, they had to abandon the spark plug. The future belonged to the diesel engine, an engine that ignites fuel by compressing air until it becomes hot enough to burn diesel fuel. This was not just a different way to move a piston. In an American farm field, a diesel engine meant a tractor could run at wide-open throttle from dawn until dusk, burning less fuel while delivering a pulling force that simply refused to bog down when the plow hit heavy, compacted soil. To master this technology, International Harvester concentrated its heavy engine manufacturing at the sprawling Melrose Park plant in Illinois. This facility became the nerve center for IH's industrial and heavy agricultural power. Early IH diesels used a complex but ingenious system that allowed the engine to start on gasoline and mechanically switch over to diesel once warmed up, solving the cold weather starting problems that plagued early compression ignition designs. But by the 1960s, as fuel injection, a system that sprays fuel into the engine more precisely than a carburetor, advanced IH began producing pure, direct injection diesel blocks that would define the company's golden era. The true breakthrough, however, was not just the shift to diesel. It was the architecture of the engine block itself. International Harvester adopted a design philosophy that would secure the absolute loyalty of American mechanics and farmers. The wet sleeve block. In a traditional automotive engine, the cylinders are bored directly into the solid cast iron of the engine block, the main structure that holds the major internal parts. When those cylinder walls eventually wore out from thousands of hours of friction, the entire block had to be removed from the vehicle, stripped down, and shipped to a specialized machine shop to be bored oversize. In rural America, during the critical weeks of the autumn harvest, a farmer did not have weeks to wait for a machine shop. A tractor with a worn-out engine was a financial disaster. International Harvester solved this by building heavy-duty diesel engines, where the cylinders were not permanently cast into the block. Instead, they used removable iron tubes, called wet sleeves, that were pressed into the block and surrounded directly by the liquid cooling system. If an IH diesel lost compression, the squeezing of air inside the cylinder before combustion, or wore out a cylinder, the repair did not require a machine shop. A local dealer or a competent farmer could drop the oil pan, pull the cylinder head, remove the piston and connecting rod, the part that links the piston to the crankshaft, and physically push the worn iron sleeve out of the block. They could then drop a brand new sleeve, piston, and rings right back into the chassis while the tractor still sat in a dirt floor machine shed. This design turned a massive industrial overhaul into an accessible in-frame repair. It created an absolute mode of user trust. A farmer buying an International Harvester diesel knew they were buying a machine that could be rebuilt indefinitely using parts purchased from the local dealer counter. This engineering philosophy culminated in 1971 with the introduction of the 400 series engine family, and specifically the legendary DT466. The DT466 was an inline six-cylinder diesel engine with 466 cubic inches of displacement. It was heavily cast, flawlessly balanced, and equipped with a turbocharger, a device driven by exhaust gases that forces more air into the engine to create massive power without increasing engine size. The DT466 was a masterpiece of American iron. It was first dropped into massive agricultural machines like the Farmall 1066, a tractor that became an instant icon in the Midwest for its raw power and near-indestructible bottom end. But the engine was too good to be confined to the dirt. International Harvester soon began installing the DT466 into its medium-duty highway trucks, delivery fleets, and school buses. In American school bus yards and regional freight terminals, the DT466 earned a reputation as the million-mile engine. Fleet mechanics loved it for the exact same reason farmers did. The wet sleeve design meant a fleet maintenance shop could rebuild a tired DT466 over a weekend without ever pulling the block out of the truck frame. It became the backbone of IH's commercial power, dominating the medium-duty truck market and establishing a mechanical footprint that stretched from the wheat fields of Kansas to the delivery alleys of Chicago. By the mid-1970s, International Harvester was no longer just a tractor company. It was a vertically integrated industrial empire. They mined their own coal, forged their own steel, built their own trucks, and designed engines that defined durability. IH had built a diesel engine that mechanics trusted and farmers depended on. They had not yet realized that engineering perfection could not survive a fractured balance sheet. By the 1970s, International Harvester had reached a scale of industrial power that felt absolute. The company was no longer just building engines. It was manufacturing the rhythm of the American harvest. From the heavy clay of the Ohio Valley to the sprawling wheat fields of Kansas, the sound of a red tractor pulling a heavy implement was the sound of the American economy functioning exactly as intended. At the center of this golden era were two industrial fortresses, the Farmall plant in Rock Island, Illinois, and the massive engine foundry in Melrose Park. These were not just factories. They were enclosed cities of heat, noise, and generational labor. Melrose Park poured millions of pounds of molten iron, casting the heavy blocks that would become the legendary 400 series diesels. The factory floor vibrated with the stamping of steel, the machining of cylinder heads, the upper part of the engine that helps seal the cylinders and contains valves, and the precise assembly of the wet sleeve architecture. When a DT-466 engine rolled off the line, it was not merely a piece of inventory. It was a promise of uninterrupted labor. International Harvester had grown into a sprawling conglomerate. They were a vertically integrated giant, producing their own steel at the Wisconsin Steelworks, owning their own coal mines, and shipping products on their own logistics networks. By 1979, the company was generating over $8 billion in annual sales and employing nearly 100,000 workers worldwide. They had a construction equipment division known as Payline, painting massive bulldozers and loaders yellow to fight Caterpillar in the dirt. They built the Scout, an early pioneer of the American SUV, which became a staple of rural driveways. But their undisputed crown jewel remained the heavy-duty diesel engine, and it soon expanded far beyond the dirt of the farm. IH engineers realized that the same low-end torque that could drag a massive chisel plow could also move American freight. The DT-4SC6 was dropped into the International Lodestar in the later SC Series medium-duty trucks. Almost overnight, the engine took over the American highway. If a delivery truck was backing into a Chicago grocery alley, if a dump truck was hauling gravel in a suburban subdivision, or if a snowplow was clearing a county road in Wisconsin, there was a very high probability it was powered by an International Harvester diesel. But the most trusted application of IH power was in the American school bus fleet. Manufacturers like Ward, Bluebird, and Thomas built buses relied heavily on International chassis and engines. For a generation of Americans, the sound of childhood mornings was the distinct, heavy mechanical clatter of an International diesel engine idling at the end of a rural driveway. Fleet managers for school districts across the country standardized on the DT-466 because of its wet sleeve rebuildability. A district mechanic could overhaul the engine during summer break right in the bus barn, ensuring it was ready for another decade of stopping and starting on rural routes. On the agricultural side, the tractors grew into behemoths. The IH-1066 and 1466 models became legends of the 1970s Midwest. Equipped with turbocharged diesel power, these machines could pull six-bottom plows through unyielding soil without breaking a sweat. Farmers measured their prosperity by the size of the red machinery parked inside their machine sheds. The engine had become a symbol of generational endurance. In an America where an engine could decide whether a field was cut, a truck made its delivery, a school bus safely crossed a county line, or a harvest beat the coming winter freeze, power was not an abstraction. It was iron, fuel, labor, heat, sound, repair, and trust. An engine, no matter how perfectly cast, cannot survive on horsepower alone. It requires an ecosystem. By the late 1970s, International Harvester was not just a manufacturer. It was an American infrastructure. The company operated a sprawling network of over 3,000 agricultural and truck dealerships across the United States. From the logging roads of the Pacific Northwest to the deep clay fields of the Ohio Valley, an American worker was never far from the familiar red and black IH pylon sign. This network was the lifeblood of the empire. Inside these rural dealerships, the parts counter was a sacred space. A local mechanic could walk in, drop a broken connecting rod on the Formica counter, and the parts manager would open a massive, oil-stained paper catalog. The system was seamless. An overhaul kit for a DT-466 could be pulled from the back room, loaded into the bed of a pickup truck, and installed before the weekend was over. Mechanics trusted the brand because the engineers in Chicago seemed to respect the reality of the people turning the wrenches. They did not hide the engine behind unnecessary covers or require specialized proprietary tools for basic maintenance. The water pump was accessible. The fuel injection pump was right there on the side of the block. For the men who spent their lives covered in grease and diesel fuel, International Harvester was not just a brand. It was a partner in the physical labor of building the country. This trust translated into massive sales during the agricultural boom of the 1970s. Global demand for American crops, fueled by massive Soviet grain purchases, pushed farmers to plant fence row to fence row. To meet this frenzied demand, IH launched the 86C series tractors. These machines featured the futuristic control center cab, placing the operator forward of the rear axle to isolate them from noise and heat. But beneath the sheet metal, the heart of the machine remained the same unyielding, wet-sleeve diesel block. In 1979, IH sold over $3 billion worth of agricultural equipment alone. They were a titan, moving the earth, hauling the freight, and harvesting the grain. Yet this unprecedented scale concealed a dangerous reality. International Harvester was suffering from profound corporate bloat. The same vertical integration that had made them powerful, owning their own Wisconsin steel mill, operating their own coal mines, and manufacturing everything from heavy highway trucks to Cub Cadet lawnmowers, had become a financial anchor. They were fighting a multi-front war against the most ruthless industrial competitors on Earth. They were battling John Deere in the farm fields, Caterpillar in the construction dirt, Ford in the school bus yards, and Chevy in the consumer driveway with the Scout SUV. Maintaining these sprawling, aging factories required massive amounts of capital. The Melrose Park engine plant and the Farmall works were historic, but they were deeply inefficient compared to the modernized assembly lines being built by their rivals. International Harvester was generating billions in revenue, but its profit margins were terrifyingly thin. They were surviving on borrowed money, carrying an astronomical debt load to keep the foundries burning and the assembly lines moving. The executives in Chicago were blinded by their own size. They believed that because the iron was flawless, the company was invincible. They assumed the American farmer would never stop buying, the trucking fleets would never stop ordering, and the interest rates on their massive loans would remain manageable. The engine was perfect. The dealer network was vast, and the sound of a red tractor at harvest felt permanent. But the foundation holding it all together had already begun to crack. The first crack was almost invisible to the farmers sitting in the cab of an '86 series tractor. It did not sound like a rod knock, and it did not look like a leaking head gasket. The crack appeared on the balance sheet. Despite generating billions of dollars in revenue during the late 1970s, International Harvester was suffocating under its own weight. The manufacturing costs, the raw expense of pouring iron, machining blocks, and maintaining aging, sprawling factory towns were bleeding the company dry. IH had built a machine that was heavy, durable, and highly trusted, but they were spending significantly more to build a tractor than their chief rival, John Deere. To survive, the executives in Chicago realized they had to break the old system. The corporate leadership, driven by a desperate need to cut overhead, demanded massive concessions from the United Auto Workers, UAW. They wanted to change overtime rules and streamline the factory floors to match the efficiency of their competitors. The union, representing generations of workers who had built their lives around the Melrose Park engine plant and the Farmall works, refused. On November 1, 1979, the system stopped. The UAW went on strike, and for 172 days, the foundries went completely cold. This was a fatal blow, not just to the corporate bank account, but to the ecosystem that made International Harvester engines viable in the American market. The strike severed the service network, the dealers, mechanics, and parts suppliers that kept the machinery running. In the middle of winter maintenance season, when farmers traditionally rebuilt their engines for the coming spring, the parts counters ran dry. A mechanic working in a rural Ohio dealership suddenly could not order the replacement wet sleeves, pistons, or bearings required to overhaul a DT466. For the first time in generations, an American farmer walked into an International Harvester dealership with a broken machine, and the dealer had to tell them they did not have the parts to fix it. That kind of mechanical trust, once broken, is rarely repaired. Farmers who had driven red tractors their entire lives, facing the relentless schedule of the planting season, quietly walked across the street and bought green tractors from John Deere, simply because Deere could deliver the machine and the parts. When the strike finally ended in April 1980, International Harvester was a severely wounded animal. The company had lost nearly $500 million in just 6 months. But the executives believed that if they simply restarted the foundries, the loyal American farmer would return. They poured massive amounts of borrowed capital into restarting the assembly lines, building thousands of new tractors and medium-duty trucks, assuming the market would absorb them. Instead, they drove straight into a macroeconomic wall. The early 1980s delivered the American farm crisis, an economic shock that fundamentally destroyed the rural buying cycle. To combat rampant inflation, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates to unprecedented heights, peaking near 20%. Suddenly, the math of American farming collapsed. Land values plummeted. Crop prices fell. A farmer could no longer afford to borrow money at 20% interest to buy a $40,000 tractor, no matter how reliable its diesel engine was. The sprawling dealer network, once the absolute strength of the empire, became a graveyard of unsold inventory. Across the Midwest, brand new red tractors and heavy-duty trucks sat parked in rows, their diesel engines completely silent, baking in the summer sun and freezing under winter snow. Dealerships that had been run by the same families for 50 years began to default on their loans and close their doors. The company found itself trapped in a lethal paradox. The engines themselves, the DT486 blocks, the heavy V8 diesels, the 400 series agricultural power plants, were mechanically flawless. They were exactly what the American worker needed. But Force 4, fuel, oil, supply chains and energy shocks, and Force 1, manufacturing costs, had conspired to make them unsellable. International Harvester was bleeding cash at a rate of millions of dollars a day, and the men in Chicago were about to realize that the only way to save the engine was to sacrifice the empire. To service its astronomical debt, International Harvester began to cannibalize itself. The executives in Chicago, forced into a corner by their creditors, started amputating the limbs of the company to keep the heart beating. In 1980, the legendary Scout SUV, a vehicle that had pioneered the American four-wheel drive consumer market, was abruptly canceled. In 1981, the Payline Construction Equipment Division, the yellow machines that had once fought Caterpillar for control of American dirt, was sold to Dresser Industries. That same year, the Cub Cadet Lawn and Garden Tractor Division was sold off. But amputating the extremities was not enough. The core of the company, the agricultural division that had defined farming since 1902, was hemorrhaging capital. The 1980s American farm crisis had frozen the market. Dealerships that once sold billions of dollars of equipment in a single year were now staring at silent, unsold inventory. The interest rates were too high, the crop prices were too low, and the farmers simply stopped buying. Then the final shock arrived. On November 26, 1984, the executives realized that to save the commercial trucks and the engine foundries, they had to sacrifice the soul of the company. International Harvester announced it was selling its entire agricultural equipment division to Tenneco, the corporate parent of the rival J.I. Case brand. For the American Midwest, this was not just a corporate acquisition, it was an industrial earthquake. The Farmall works in Rock Island, Illinois, the cathedral of American tractor manufacturing, a factory that had poured the iron for generations of rural life, was slated for closure. Tens of thousands of workers lost their livelihoods. Across the country, the sprawling, fiercely loyal dealer network was fractured. Many historic IH dealerships were forced to close their doors, while others were absorbed into the new Case IH network, their familiar red and black signs pulled down and replaced. But Force 6, corporate consolidation, acquisition, and brand survival, created one of the most profound paradoxes in American mechanical history. Tenneco bought the tractors, the planters, and the agricultural patents, but they did not buy the highway trucks. And crucially, they did not buy the heavy engine division. Stripped of the right to use its own historic name in agriculture, the hollowed-out shell of the company was forced to rebrand. In 1986, International Harvester became Navistar International. Navistar survived because the engines it inherited were simply too vital to the American economy to let die. The Melrose Park engine plant kept its foundries burning because the DT4 Scott wet sleeve diesel was still the undisputed king of the medium-duty truck market. Fleet managers, school districts, and delivery companies did not care about the collapse of the tractor division. They cared that a DT466 could be rebuilt in a bus barn over a weekend without pulling the block out of the chassis. And simultaneously, the engine engineers in Chicago had quietly secured another lifeline. Just before the collapse, IH had developed a 6.9-liter, naturally aspirated V8 diesel engine. It featured indirect injection, a system where fuel is sprayed into a small pre-chamber before entering the main cylinder, allowing for quieter operation and lower stress on internal parts compared to heavy industrial diesels. In 1982, Ford Motor Company, desperate for a diesel engine to compete with General Motors, began dropping this exact International Harvester V8 into its heavy-duty pickup trucks. While the IH tractor factories were being padlocked, the IH engine division was single-handedly launching the modern American diesel pickup torquing war. Over the next decade, millions of Ford trucks roamed American highways, hauling livestock, towing fifth-wheel trailers, and powering construction sites with 6.9-liter and later 7.3-liter IDI engines, designed by a company that no longer existed in its original form. The agricultural empire had been dismantled, but the iron had refused to break. The engine still ran. The orders slowed. The interest rates climbed. The factory gates were locked. The name came off the signs. The red tractors were sold away. The badge remained on the highway. The farm it was built for was gone. Today, the name International Harvester no longer exists on a corporate ledger. The sprawling, vertically integrated conglomerate that once mined its own coal, forged its own steel, and built the machines that fed the world was completely dismantled by the end of the 1980s. Yet the iron they poured refused to disappear. Navistar International, the corporate survivor of the 1984 collapse, became a dominant force in American commercial freight, delivery fleets, and school buses. The legendary DT466 diesel engine, an engine originally designed to pull heavy agricultural implements through unyielding clay, remained in continuous production for decades after the tractor division was sold. It eventually transitioned from mechanical fuel injection to electronic controls, but its core identity, the infinitely rebuildable wet sleeve block, remained intact until modern emission standards finally forced its retirement in the 21st century. It is still considered by many fleet managers and heavy-duty mechanics to be the greatest medium-duty truck engine ever built in America. And in a surprise footnote of industrial history, the V8 diesels that International Harvester engineered out of sheer desperation became the absolute foundation of the modern American diesel pickup market. Ford relied on Navistar-built engines, eventually branded as the Power Stroke, to power millions of heavy-duty trucks well into the 2000s. The company that lost its tractor empire quietly became the undisputed king of American diesel torque, powering the construction crews, hotshot haulers, and tradesmen of a new century. The badge on the grille said Ford, but the iron block under the hood was born in the foundries of International. Beyond the commercial highways, the agricultural soul of International Harvester survives in a sprawling, fiercely dedicated American preservation culture. Every summer across the Midwest and the Great Plains, thousands of people gather at events like the Red Power Roundup. These are not just nostalgic car shows. They are massive congregations of working iron. You will see rows of Farmall M's, 1066 and 86 series tractors, meticulously restored or proudly wearing their original sun-faded red paint. You will find old farmers, young mechanics, and preservationists sifting through swap meets, hunting for rare parts, dog-eared service catalogs, and new old stock engine components. In the world of competitive tractor pulling, heavily modified IH diesels are still pushed to produce triple their factory horsepower, proving the absolute structural integrity of the original cast iron blocks. This is not nostalgia. An old International Harvester tractor sitting in a machine shed is a physical argument about how American power was once understood. It represents an era of absolute mechanical independence. Today, modern agricultural equipment is often locked behind proprietary software, digital rights management, and sealed electronic systems. A modern farmer often cannot repair their own machine in the dirt. They must wait for a corporate technician with a laptop to clear a diagnostic code before the tractor can pull a plow. The preservation of IH iron is a rebellion against this replacement culture. When a farmer overhauls a wet sleeve IH diesel today, using a wrench and an oil-stained manual, they are not just fixing a tractor. They are keeping a specific form of American self-reliance alive. The physical empire that built that iron, however, is mostly gone. The massive Farmall works in Rock Island, Illinois, the cathedral of American tractor manufacturing, was completely demolished in the 1990s. The site where generations of workers cast the heavy blocks and assembled the red machinery is now occupied by commercial warehouses and parking lots. The local, family-owned dealerships that anchored rural American towns have largely been replaced by regional corporate megadealers. The original service network is a ghost. The collapse of International Harvester is a reminder that engineering perfection cannot protect a company from macroeconomic gravity. They built the internal combustion engines that replaced the draft horse. They engineered the diesel blocks that earned the absolute trust of the American worker. But they failed to understand that an empire built on heavy iron, sprawling foundries, and massive debt could be broken by a shift in interest rates and a sudden freeze in the agricultural economy. The corporation fell, but the engine won. The metal was simply too strong to die with the balance sheet. America did not stop needing power. It simply changed the name on the company door. Somewhere in a rural American machine shop, a heavy cast iron DT-466 block still sits on an engine stand, coated in grease, waiting for a new set of wet sleeves. And somewhere in the Midwest, under a fading barn roof, an old red Farmall waits for the spring thaw, the heavy iron holding on to a time when the sound of a mechanical harvest belonged to a company that changed the world, lost its name, and left its strength in the dirt. See you in the next one.